Hey guys, Jason here, joined by Andrew, back with another Duel Masters TCG deck profile. Today's deck is going to be GRUB Mid-range, which we affectionately refer to as Swapbox. Now, this deck was originally conceived as a tribute to the Bombazar Black decks from the OCG. This was at around the time that Bombazar was limited to 1 on the Hall of Fame, and so players started playing it with Darkness, I guess because you could retrieve Bombazar from the graveyard if your opponent removed it. We also wanted a deck that focused on Cryptic Totem because, Andrew, we think Cryptic Totem is a pretty interesting card. It avoids shield triggers, but I also realized that it's not the easiest thing to support.
Yeah, which is pretty funny because when we look at Cryptic Totem, he comes out actually relatively early as 6. But I think getting him to stick is the problem.
So let's get into the list. Starting off, we have 4 Bronze Arm Tribes and 4 Aquahulkus. So nothing too suspicious there. These are just, really good creatures for mid-range / beatdown decks.
I think Bronze Arm in particular really holds the deck together. Sometimes when you don't hit Bronze Arm on 3, it feels like you're just charging for the next 2 turns and it's not good.
Yes.
So Bronze Arm really is important to hit on curve.
Yeah, and also we appreciate the bodies because Cryptic Totem is the main finisher we want to focus on, though he is not the only one. Now, moving on, we also have 3 copies of Energy Stream. I'll just chuck these over here. Energy Stream lets us draw cards. It's another 3-drop. We actually used to have Eureka Charger in here, but as Andrew pointed out, if you don't hit Bronze Arm on 3, let's say we don't hit Hulkus on 3, it's just Brick City,
just charge 2 times in a row.
And we also find that this deck is kind of weak to discard, so being able to draw 2 helps a little bit with that. Now, what else are we packing? We also have 3 copies of Locomotiver. So Locomotiver is pretty cool. This is a card that I often sleep on. I always forget. I never realize how good it is just when you look at it on paper. But then on practice, Loco has a lot of neat applications. Sometimes the discard 1 is just awfully inconvenient for the opponent. The body can trade sometimes. It's a Soulswap target.
Yeah. It's also terrible to break into.
And, sometimes, let's say we don't open with Bronze Arm on 3. If we're able to open with Aquahulkus on 3 and follow it up with a Locomotiver, it's not that bad. We actually messed around with 2 Locomotivers for a while, but it felt like a really big difference, at least to me. We just weren't seeing it at all. So, difference between 2 and 3, pretty big apparently. Now, because we love creatures, weenies, we are playing more weenies. We've got 3 copies of Corisle. This deck is Weenie Hut Jr. No. So Corisle is a great follow-up to Bronze Arm Tribe. There are some problematic early drops that exist in the format, things like Palolesis or Sirion, which are just really early and really strong. So Corisle can help alleviate the pressure of those sorts of cards. But another reason Corisle is very strong, particularly in this deck, is because it interacts remarkably well with the finishers. Now, we talked about Cryptic Totem at the start of the video. We are also playing Bolmedius in this deck, and Corisle has a very strong interaction with those because if you manage to play Corisle and one of your finishers on the same turn, it just bricks your opponent and it really sets up your path to victory because they just draw into a creature, not very useful, and then you just dodge all their shield triggers, you break all their shields. It's a good time. Well, not for the other player.
Yeah, so in a similar regard, Corisle also interacts really well with Bazagazil Dragon with Soulswap as well. So what you do is you can actually just play out Corisle and then Soulswap Corisle out for the Bazagazil as well. That way, your opponent doesn't really have a draw. He's bricked in that sense, and then also the creature that you just sent back with Corisle, if they do play it, you can just Baz it the next turn as well. So it's a pretty pretty unfun combo to play against.
So taking a quick break from creatures, we are also playing 3 copies of Searing Wave. This deck can be a bit sensitive to faster decks. Our earliest plays come out on turn 3 after all, so we have elected to play the fastest board clear in Searing Wave. It curves off Bronze Arm, and it also only affects our opponent. I think that is the main reason why we are playing it. We want to keep our board so that Cryptic Totem will have creatures to swing with. Now, here we get into the janky portion of the deck, which I think Andrew is a big fan of. We are playing one copy of Corpse Charger for that graveyard retrieval. Low key, the reason for the Corpse Charger is because we're playing Searing Wave. What if we hit one of our good cards off that? We'll want to get it back. But also, you know, it's a form of ramp. It's a little bit of resistance to discard. And a lot of, we play quite a few one-ofs in this deck, creatures, so helps get those back. And then for the last of the water section, I guess that's a bit of a spoiler there, we've got 2 copies of Thrashcrawler. Why do we like Thrashcrawler, Andrew?
You know, it's a big blocker that, you know, sometimes in the late game that you're down on shields, you just need a blocker to survive. Also, Thrashcrawler can get back, you know, Searing Wave to clear your opponent's board, or even, like we said before, one of your big boss monsters.
Yeah. Another reason I like Thrashcrawler is because, we play 4 civs in this deck, and 4 civs are not the easiest thing to balance, especially with a 40-card limit. Yeah. And we often find ourselves, because of the importance of playing Bronze Arm on 3, it's very common that we charge Soulswap so we can play Bronze Arm. And, Thrashcrawler helps us get that Soulswap back later in the game if we need it. Another interesting card that I really like in this deck is Rumbling Terrahorn, and this card was actually Andrew's idea, so I'll let him talk about it.
Yeah, so Rumbling Terrahorn really works well with the finishes that you'll soon see. Because he comes out earlier, you can decide on which finisher kind of suits the board the best. We tried, you know, multiple copies of the finishers instead of Rumbling Terrahorn before, but we just found the flexibility really, you know, suits this deck and kind of cements it, especially considering the playstyle.
Yeah, that's true. And now we can talk about the ace card of the deck. It is the namesake. We've got 4 copies of Soulswap. I think this is the first, like, non-super gimmicky deck to use Soulswap, and seeing the interactions with all of the come into play effects is pretty wild. We've talked about a lot of the main applications with the boss cards. I think the main thing that keeps Baz-a-Gazeel balanced is how playing Baz is your whole turn.
Yes.
And when you can play Baz and something else, especially with that 8 mana, I think it's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. When you get Baz for 3 mana, it's pretty insane.
And another really cool thing about Soulswap is that it's a form of soft removal. You know, you can get rid of your opponent's stuff, you hard cast it, and you know, you swap out a threat for something that can get hit by your Searing Wave, you know. You never know. The next card I'm going to talk about is the only multi-civ card in the deck, and this is Miraculous Rebirth. So I think we used to play 2 Miraculous Rebirths at some point, but we cut down to 1.
We got fed up hitting it from Bronze Arm Tribe.
Miraculous Rebirth is a pretty interesting card in the deck. It's a form of removal, and quite often it's like a +2 because you know, a lot of the creatures that we have come into play effects. The colors are also pretty good for it because, you know, we run fire, we run nature. Good help with mana fixing if you open with it. Unfortunately, we don't have any 2-drops for it, but that's okay. Actually, one of the reasons why I put back the 3rd Loco was because when I'd hit a 4-drop with this, I would quite often whiff, and I'm like, this is not supposed to happen. So, you know, extra Loco, there you go. I think you could reasonably cut this card, but for its mana fixing and, you know, sometimes it's pretty clutch, I would keep it in.
Yeah. I think if you use it on, like, Misreads or something like that, it's pretty good.
Yeah. Super funny if you use it on Aqua Surfer, you can get out your Cryptic Totem.
Yeah.
Alright, so speaking of destruction spells, we are also playing 3 copies of Terra Pit. This is just a generically good shield trigger. I would say it is our best defensive shield trigger. It's also Darkness mana fodder, never a bad thing. And Terra Pit is gonna keep making appearances in all of our decks. So now we can move on to the very fun part of the deck. We have an assortment of Toolbox Finishers over here. So we've got 2 copies of Cryptic Totem, 1 copy of Magma Dragon Jagalzor, 1 copy of Bolmedius, and 1 copy of Baz-a-Gazeel. So, Cryptic Totem, I think this is actually a conversation Andrew and I had very early on, maybe like a year or two ago. And I was like, what if we play Magma Dragon Jagalzor with Cryptic Totem? One of the most powerful plays that this deck can make is if you are on 8 mana, if you have 3 creatures on board and access to Cryptic and Jagalzor, you can actually win on that turn. So you have 3 creatures out on your board. Let's say you soul swap one of them for Cryptic Totem or Jagalzor, and then with the remaining mana, you hard cast the other one. All you have to do is like break with one of your creatures that doesn't have summoning sickness. If you don't hit a shield trigger, well, the Turbo Rush activates to give Cryptic speed attacker, and then you just break all your opponent's shields, and it's over. So I think that is a very strong play, and I think that was really what made me in my mind think, this is kind of Bombazar-esque, right? We're just pulling a win out of nowhere.
Yeah, and you have to remember that that is one combo, but also all the cards themselves are really flexible. So sometimes, I don't know, you can just stick this guy for a turn, and then you play a bunch of creatures, and then you just soul swap into this, and you just win.
Yes, that is also true. Yeah, that's pretty nuts, because when Cryptic swings, Jagalzor gives everyone speed attacker.
Yeah.
So Bombazar is a pretty late inclusion in the deck. I just found that it wasn't reasonable to always rely on Cryptic Totem just because he has setup required. So, Bombazar, if you can get him out, this deck does have some ramp. You can just solo the opponent if the conditions are right. And then Bazagazil, we've talked a lot about this card already. It can brick some decks that can't deal with control, and it's super annoying, especially with Soulswap and Coral.
It can basically win a game or win a matchup on itself sometimes.
Yeah. For that reason, Andrew and I actually we argued a little bit about playing multiple copies of Baz.
Yeah, I think initially we had 2 as well.
Yeah. Bazes can be really strong, but sometimes it's also a brick.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always a trade-off.
Yeah. And what would a Darkness Rampy Control-ish deck be without Lost Soul? So we are running 2 copies, only 2 copies, but that is enough for most decks, I think.
Yeah.
Now the final card we're going to talk about is Apocalypse Vice, and this is, in my opinion, the flex spot of the deck. So Apocalypse Vice is very useful. It's good as a spot removal. It's also good as a board clear. Now, I think this is what the second Baz got cut for. Sometimes, you just need to deal with multiple creatures, and Apocalypse Vice does that. But I'm sure there's a whole plethora of other cards that you could play instead of this. I just thought the 4th board clear was necessary. So here's a bird's eye view of the deck. Now, in terms of flow, as you can see, we really just want to be playing our advantage generating cards on curve. It does tend to vary from game to game just because there are a couple of different ways of closing games out. Sometimes, you might want to go aggro on the opponent, just swing for all their shields, turbo Lost Soul, it's a good time. Sometimes, and more often, I think you'll be going for a more control-based approach, trying to stick a Cryptic or a Bombazar and then finishing the game. Because there is so much, variance in this deck, how games play out even in the same matchup can end up quite different, and that is, I think, what makes this deck pretty exciting. This deck has a lot of options, it has a lot of answers, but sometimes it struggles to find them, so the burden is on the player to really use their creativity to maneuver out of tough situations.
Yeah, so that's one thing I quite like about this deck, is that it has a chance against any deck. A lot of times, you just randomly win. You just feel like you just get all the right pieces together and you just win. But otherwise, it does struggle a little bit with control decks, especially with this card. You can see that most of these cards, they don't generate that much advantage by themselves. Only Energy Stream and Alcoholcus really do. So an early Cranium Clamp can hurt this deck. There's also the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum with early rush decks. This deck doesn't have too many tools. You can, oftentimes Soulswap can be quite handy. Of course, you've got your Steering Wave, but if you don't hit your Bronze Arm on curve, then it can be a problem.
I think the untargetable stuff as well can give this deck some headaches. Stuff like Petrova and Warlord Elzonius, as we saw in a past video. But to be honest, I feel this deck feels like it's 50-50 against everything. Like, we talked about how this deck loses to these archetypes. But when you play the matchup, it feels pretty even.
Yeah, it always feels winnable. Because there's just so much things that this deck can do.
Now, in terms of other options, well, we wish we could play more copies of Bronze Arm Tribe. We reckon it's the best card in the deck next to Soulswap, I guess. We did try Fairy Life, Essence Elf, and Poisonous Mushroom at one point. Poisonous Mushroom is probably the best candidate.
Yeah.
But, it's just really hard to balance out all of the colors and like the draw and the ramp. So we ultimately settled on the Max Bronze Arm and Max Hulkus with a couple of energy streams. Andrew, if only there was a card that held the civs of this deck together that could board clear and draw cards,
Is that a little teaser?
For the discard, Cranium Clamp and Gallic were also considered for this deck. Cranium Clamp is neat because you can, I guess, counter brick the opponent, for lack of a better term, but, it doesn't have a body, which is kind of a problem. Gallic is neat, but I think Locomotiver, for the combination of cost, mono civ, and shield trigger, was the best fit.
Yeah. Also, remember the playstyle of the deck isn't like heavy control, so I don't think Cranium Clamp actually fits that well in this list.
Mecha Dragon's Breath is also neat. We talked about Petrova. Tajamal can also be a headache sometimes, or just like blockers in general when you're trying to finish a game. So Mecha Dragon's Breath, I think, is a card that comes up more and more in the deck profiles. So there's that. Meltdown Pyro, if you really hate aggro, that it's something that this deck can support. It has the colors, and Soulswap Baz is kind of like a Pyro. So there's an additional
I
out.
didn't even realize what the...
And the last thing I'll talk about is if you want a more control-oriented playstyle, if you characterize this deck by the Toolbox Finishers, particularly the Cryptic Jagalzor combination, you could actually chuck those guys into the Forcive Forbos control deck. You remove water, you play light, you might be able to support it if you want that. It's a lot of 6-drops though. And that's the deck. This is one of my personal favorite decks of the season. A lot of time went into this, just a lot of time theory crafting. Many times just me laying in bed at 2 a.m. thinking, is there a better way to manage the civilizations? Because, the Dark and the Fire sections are pretty light.
Well, yeah, I mean, for like a full civ deck, it's pretty hard.
Exactly. But yeah, I think those... The lack of sleep was worth it. I really enjoy this deck. But hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Stay tuned for more videos coming soon. As always, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.